Good morning, friends, and welcome. My name is Katie Grosh, and I'm the Faith Initiative Coordinator at Grace Farms Foundation. I'm so glad that you're able to be with us today for a conversation with Leah Sarna on the classic text Pirkei Avot. Our conversation today is part of the Books on Faith and Meaning series, oriented around the Faith Initiative's core question. And that question is, what is the shape of flourishing life? As we engage with these different books, both ancient and modern, we want to ask how these texts can help us make progress in our quest to answer this fundamental question of flourishing life, both for ourselves and for our communities. Our assumption is that reading is never enough, but at the same time, these texts can give us access to people, to histories, and to ideas that if we allow them to do their work on us, we think they can contribute substantially to our quest for flourishing life. Before we begin today, I just want to make a couple of brief housekeeping notes. First, this webinar meeting is being recorded, so we can share the conversation later with a broader audience in addition to all of you who are with us live. And second, if you are with us live today, please feel free to use the Q&A function at any point during the discussion. No need to wait to the end to ask your questions. Just type them in the chat as they occur to you, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible and weave them in throughout the conversation. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Matthew Croasmun, Faith Initiative Director at Grace Farms.
Thanks, Katie. You know, it is a truism, perhaps a bit cliche, that modern life is fast-paced. Keeping up, staying current can feel like an impossible task. And in the midst of all that frenetic activity, it can seem like what we need most of all is sort of up-to-the-minute contemporary analysis of our moment, maybe some tips and tricks from they're just tuned perfectly for the current moment. And that stuff can be incredibly important, but often just for the same reasons, because of just that fast-paced nature of our lives. In just these sorts of moments, what we need most of all is ancient wisdom. Ancient wisdom that offers a sort of non-anxious perspective on the perennial concerns that resurface again and again. And our text for today, the rabbinic text, Pirkei Avot, the sayings of the fathers, is just one such text. Nearly 2,000-year-old wisdom that speaks directly into the ethical challenges that we face every day. To help us find our way into this ancient gem, we have Rabbinit Leah Sarna. She is the Associate Director of Education and Director of High School Programs at the Drisha Institute in the Bronx. She was ordained at Yeshivat Maharat in 2018 after having graduated from Yale in 2014 with a bachelor's in philosophy and psychology. She was a student in the inaugural Life Worth Living course at Yale. She has a longer connection to Life Worth Living at Yale than I do. And she is a regular guest in the course, speaking to students about Jewish visions of flourishing life, always one of our favorite guests. Leah, I'm so glad that you can be with us today. It's good to see you.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm thrilled to join the community at Grace Farms.
Well, I'm glad to have you connecting with this community, and I think a lot of what we have to talk about with this text. I mean, we should just say at the beginning, it's a vast text. We're not going to go line by line, but I'm just hoping that what we can do in our conversation is maybe help someone who might be a little bit intimidated by like an ancient text, a rabbinic text, maybe if Judaism isn't their tradition, or maybe if it is and they haven't sort of accessed these texts before, just sort of get over that activation energy. What would it take? Is this a text that I could take up in my own quest to sort of understand what it might be to live a good life and how I could actually go about doing that?
I definitely think this is a text that with a few kind of key pointers, everyone can get something out of. It's a text that contains multitudes. So I know we're going to talk about the rabbinic orientation towards dispute. It's definitely a text that you'll read it and you'll say, didn't it just say the opposite thing a few pages ago? And that's normal in rabbinic texts, and we can talk about why. But we find in the Jewish tradition, we find that truth is found through debate, and preserving even the losers in any given debate is a very, very important and core part of our written culture. So that's also something that we can discuss, but that might be a bit of a jarring piece of our wisdom literature. If you're used to, let's say, reading someone like Aristotle, who it's written by one person and there's one voice and it's all meant to be coherent, maybe compare this more to like a Platonic dialogue. But even then, the losers are recorded, but the winner is always Plato or the Socrates, however you want to read who the Socrates character is. The winner is always Socrates. And in Jewish texts, it's sometimes not clear for maybe another generation or another 1,000 years who the winner is, if ever. There's the Jewish community is a very diverse community, and sometimes when it seems like, oh, this is a minority opinion, it's actually lived out by Jews in Yemen or something in that direction. So that's something that could be a little bit disorienting if a beginner were to open Pirkei Avot. And the other thing I would say, I was gonna say at the same time that can actually be really inviting, right? Because like when it comes to something as big as like, what is flourishing life? Like, how do I find meaning and purpose? How do I live justly and act rightly by my various responsibilities that I have in my life, whatever it might be? Those questions seem like big enough that it would be almost hard to believe that there'd be sort of like an answer book that you could just reference. Absolutely. And that's part of why we believe that there's that retaining and treasuring diversity is important, because also people are diverse and there's not necessarily one right answer for everyone.
Well, since we're on this, let's go ahead and dive in. Where would you point in Pirkei Avot to sort of see some of this sort of celebration of disagreement? Where could we look?
Sure. So one thing I think I mentioned this to you when we were preparing for this is that the numbering system for the citations is based on different manuscripts that we have, some of which are pretty old, but there's variances in manuscripts, and those get carried forward into even current publications. So if you want to point to something specific, the chapter divisions in rabbinic literature hold pretty specifically. Those chapter divisions, we're pretty sure actually predate like the chapter divisions in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, for example. The Hebrew Bible chapter divisions were created in the 1200s by a Christian, and the chapter divisions in the Talmud and in rabbinic literature are older than that, certainly. So just fun fact, and you know that, whatever, this could be for another time, but you see it in the first chapter in Genesis. Jews would have extended it to include Shabbat in the first chapter, and Genesis 2 is where Shabbat begins.
Okay.
Anyways, fine, total side point. But anyway, so I want to take us to Pirkei Avot chapter 5. And in my numbering, it's 517, but that might not be what you have in front of you. And the statement reads, "Every dispute that's for the sake of heaven will in the end endure, but one that is not for the sake of heaven will not endure." So, which is to say, disputes are good so long as they're for the sake of heaven, they're well-intentioned, and that there's loads and loads of ink spilled about what exactly it means for a dispute to be for the sake of heaven. But the Mishnah here continues, and we should probably define that term, by the way. Pirkei Avot is part of a maybe like the first code of Jewish law, which is called the Mishnah. It was codified around the year 200 by an individual named Rabbi Judah the Prince. Jews believe, and actually this is how Pirkei Avot begins. Pirkei Avot begins with sort of like a genealogy of the oral Torah. So Jews believe that at Sinai, God gave to Moses both the written Torah, which is the 5 books of Moses, and the Pentateuch, and then also an oral Torah that was preserved in teachings and statements and in the lived kind of reality of Jewish life, and then kind of taken up and transformed, particularly once the temple was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70 CE, by what some people would call like the Pharisees. In the Jewish tradition, we call the Prushim, or the rabbis, and then under further kind of Roman oppression in the times of Rabbi Judah the Prince, when it was very difficult to continue to train rabbis, he felt that it was essential for it to kind of become much more codified, even though it's literally meant to be like the oral Torah. It's not meant to be written down. He said, like the Torah is endangered, and therefore he composed the Mishnah. The Mishnah, while we talk about it often as like a written version of the oral Torah, it was also certainly meant to be memorized. And if there's ever a piece of the Mishnah that many people have memorized, it actually is Pirkei Avot. I had a teacher who said, like, what are you supposed to think about at red lights if not Pirkei Avot? Commit it to memory. But it's long for that. And Judaism has a long culture of memorization, especially because, like, if you imagine a time before the printing press, that's what was available, or things that were memorized. But anyway, so Pirkei Avot is one teeny tiny section of a much larger work called the Mishnah. And it is the only section that really just deals with like these kind of wisdom aphorisms. The rest of the Mishnah is very practical. It's like, how do I observe the Sabbath? How do I observe this holiday? How do I bring in temple times this type of sacrifice? This year is a Shemitah year. It's a sabbatical year. So how do we observe the sabbatical year in the land of Israel, for example, which is increasingly relevant in our times?
Need a sabbatical year.
What'd you say?
I said I need a sabbatical year. You got to tell me about how that works, but another time. Beautiful. But
okay, so
all right, so we have this text, and it's helpful to situate the Mishnah. So if I'm thinking there's a written Torah, which I might think of as the first 5 books of the Bible, or are they thinking of Torah in a more extensive sense of like including the rest of the Tanakh, the rest of what we might call Hebrew Bible?
So it gets confusing the way that Jews talk about it. So we see the first five books of the Hebrew Bible as kind of binding law. And any time in the Talmud that someone tries to learn law from the rest of the Tanakh, it always has to be like litigated. Like, are you even allowed to do that? I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe it's just a way to remember it. Maybe that's really oral law. So when we're having a conversation about legal texts, which Pirkei Avot is sort of a legal text, it's kind of like it sits within a context of legal texts, let's say like that. We would normally mostly be talking, when we talk about Torah, as the legal parts of the first 5 books of Moses. But other times when we talk about Torah, we mean all of Tanakh. So it's a word that is used ambiguously. The word Torah just means teaching. So that's part of why we have the ambiguity there.
But the broad context is we've got a thought that that there's Torah written down, revealed to Moses. There's also the things that weren't written down that have been passed along. And part of what we're getting access to here in the Mishnah is some of that wisdom, some of that insight, some of that instruction. So this is also sort of divine revelation of a certain sort that's been passed down, carried along, and we find it in the midst of dispute somehow. When I think of like divine revelation and dispute, like, I don't know, sometimes I think like, shouldn't divine revelation like do away with dispute, like sort of solve disputes? If this is oral Torah, why is there so much debate still captured in the midst of it?
So there's a lot of different reads on that. Some of it is maybe like a weakness amongst the generations. People like to point out. So this Mishnah that we're looking at, 517 here, says what is an example of debate, controversy for the sake of heaven. Such was the controversy of Hillel and Shammai. So Hillel and Shammai lived right around the year 0, I would say. And everyone likes to point out that you can list on 2 hands the number of actual debates between those 2 historical figures. However, their students, the Beit Hillel, the house of Hillel, and the house of Shammai. Countless debates. Almost every page that you would open in the Mishnah would contain a debate between the students of Hillel and the students of Shammai. So some would say, yes, actually, it's like a weakening of the tradition that once upon a time there was sort of like a unified wisdom that was received, and then sort of people didn't remember things as well, or didn't access the tradition right. That's certainly one school of thought. Another school of thought is that the oral law is refracted through humans, and therefore it's as diverse as humans are.
So then what is the difference between the sort of disputes that, I mean, because this is actually, I think this is a sort of pressing question for all of us, right? Because like I feel like we don't have many good examples in our world. And it's part of what sort of part of what attracts me to rabbinic literature is that here's examples of people for whom dispute about like precisely the things you're not supposed to talk about in polite company, right? Like disputes about religion and with bearing on politics, and like, I mean, anything you name it, like it's here. And here are these people who deeply disagree, and yet that disagreement somehow like builds community rather than like breaking it off. And anyway, so I just want to like set the broader context here. It feels like this is something that like as a society we really sort of need. How do you have like dispute on things of importance? We're not just arguing about like, you know, whatever, which pop artist you know you prefer. We're talking about like what is the substance of what it means to like live a good life. And yet, anyway, so there's some sort of disputes that are apparently that are good. And anyway, so is there like a sort of I don't know, like a rule we can learn here about like the sort of disputes that like build up a community and the sorts of disputes that divide it?
Yeah, so I think the way we typically understand the distinction between the good disputes, such as the disputes between Hillel and Shammai, and the bad disputes, such as the controversy of Korach. Is there a way? Certainly that's not pronounced that way in English. Korach. Korah. Okay, great. Thank you. Is that one is driven by a desire to understand the divine will, and one was driven by ego. So while Korah is just about, why should you rule? I want to be in charge. Hillel and Shammai are about, what does God want from us? And I understand what God wants from us in this way, and you understand what God wants from us in the other way, and a mutual respect of like, we're both engaged in this same really important question. We share the value of this really important question, and yet we're coming to different answers. And the Talmud points out, I think in a couple of different places, that even as there became more and more disputes between the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai, up to and including some like important disputes about like the nature of marriage, divorce, lineage, all of that stuff, they still always married into each other's families, out of this like respect and love and understanding that we're one unified community.
Wow. Well, so one thing that really catches my ear there is the thought that they have. So one sort of dispute seems to be Korah and whoever he's arguing against. There's just an argument there that's just between two people. I want power, you want power. All we can do is argue with one another. The other sort of dispute, as you described it, has like a third reference point. I'm trying to understand this thing that I understand to exist outside of me. I have my take, I have my opinion, but there's something outside of myself, and you do too, and we both have some sort of hope that we're I think about it like I'll never forget, I was in a teaching seminar led by a bunch of philosophers at Wesleyan University, and one of them came in who's a teacher of Plato. So he taught Platonic philosophy to undergraduates, and he said he always began his classes inviting his students to do what are called geometry mazes. They're these little like logic puzzles basically, and you've got a bunch of rectangles, and you know the lengths of some sides and the area of another or something like that, and you have to sort of figure out like one missing piece. And he always had his students do this exercise, in part because Plato was rather convinced that in order to do philosophy, you first needed to know how to do geometry. But second, and more to the point, was that he wanted students to remind students of what that experience is like when because first you'd work on the area mazes, and then you'd go, compare your answers with somebody next to you. And if you disagreed, how did you manage that disagreement? Right? Because when it comes to an area maze, a geometric,
the stakes are low.
Well, the stakes are low, but also there's a shared sense that like there's a right answer out there. I might have it, you might have it, we could both be wrong. But there's some sort of way that like our interaction then, like I don't want to I could come into an argument dispute about like you and I get two different results on an area maze, and I could come in and try to like win the argument by bullying, but that's not going to increase the likelihood that you and I ended up at the right answer, because if I'm wrong and just better at bullying you, like we've both lost, right? And it strikes me that,
and
like,
that's actually
Hillel
like
and
so
Shammai
much
have
of,
that sense. They share
I was
that
just
sense.
going to say, so much of Pirkei Avot is actually about that. Like, how do we engage in these arguments? I feel like almost every chapter contains something like, greet everyone with a smile, which is actually an important way, right? We're walking in, we know we're going to disagree about our area mazes, but how do I enter that conversation?
Yeah. And how much more important, as you say, like area maze is like trivially, hopefully we don't have much invested in just like a random exercise some teacher gives us. We could have profoundly distorted hearts where we get deeply invested in that. But how much more so do we need those same sorts of orientations when it comes to really, really big questions where we can disagree but with that sort of humility that that the truth presumably lies outside of both of us, even if one of us happens to have an opinion in alignment with it. We're both still subject to the same sort of external index.
But I do think there's one piece of it that's a little bit different in the Jewish tradition. So there's another mission on Pirkei Avot which talks about that same chapter, 522. Ben Bagbag says, "Turn it over and turn it over, for all is therein." And so there is a certain sense where there might be more than one truth. Like there's a little bit of like an early, like postmodern almost like strain in Jewish thought. We see it come up a few different times, articulated a few different ways. So here's one where it says, are you want to find your own, some other opinion in here? Keep turning it over, you'll find it. The Torah contains everything. Another way of saying it would be, there's the Talmud contains, it's like a lot of stories, but one main kind of epic, which is now, I was pleased to see on the Life Worth Living curriculum is now there, which is the story of the oven of Achnai. And one of the famous lines there is, these and those are words of the living God, meaning that for God to be alive means that God manifests in all sorts of different ways and actually can contain like diversity or multiplicity. Another way the Talmud says this is in the Talmud and Sota, is it was all given by one shepherd. So the same way that you could have like a whole flock of sheep and they're all different and they're all trying to do their own thing. And the job of the shepherd is to kind of keep them a flock and keep them all together. Rabbis are like the sheep. They're all different. They all have different personalities and opinions, but they're all kind of trying to keep together. And God, the shepherd, is kind of, keeping everyone together with all their diversity.
It's a beautiful image. All right. This is all, as you say, like this is really helpful what you're saying, that this is everywhere in Pirkei Avot. It's everywhere in rabbinic literature, this sort of there's a sort of intellectual generosity and intellectual humility and a sort of I was actually just writing about this the other day, because I was thinking about this question of wisdom and deeds, where you might, again, as a novice coming into the text, you might think, so the question is raised a few different times, as far as I can tell, in Pirkei Avot, which is more important, wisdom or good deeds? Do you need to know what's good, or is it more important to do what's good? Presumably at some point you're going to say false choice, you should want both. But the rabbis are willing to enter into a certain amount of like, well, no, we can get into the nuance of like where we might want to place our chips, or where we might want to sort of put our place of emphasis. And again, coming to the text, you might think, well, these are a bunch of rabbis, like surely wisdom is going to win out. They spend so much time on learning, and it's not. You get, well, I mean, maybe the simplest text. I mean, we can look at a number of texts here, but I was just looking at it again this morning. Like Shammai used to say little and do much. Or I mean, we had all sorts of, I think Rabbi Elazar's picture of the tree where the deeds are the roots and the wisdom are the branches. A tree with few deeds and lots of wisdom is like a tree with like very shallow roots and a whole lot to catch the wind, and it's going to get blown away. And the reverse, if you have a life where you're deeply invested, I guess, is it about like living a way of life? Like you're walking in these deeds, even if you don't have a whole lot of wisdom. Well, you're going to stay rooted. And maybe if you had to choose, that's the best. Help me understand this. I think this is fascinating, this sort of relationship between wisdom and good deeds.
There's a much later, like 1,000 years after the Mishnah kind of document called the Sefer HaChinuch, and he articulates, I think, this really well. He gets quoted all the time on exactly this question. His statement is, "Acharei ha'peulot nimshachot halevavot." After the heart is drawn after actions. That when you do things, that's kind of who you become, and you start to like things once you're doing them, and you become drawn to things once you've actually like acted them. And this was always I did a lot of interfaith work in college, and this was always something that was so fascinating to my Protestant friends who were sort of like, what happens if you wake up in the morning and you don't believe in God? And all the Jews around the table were like, we would go to services. And all Protestants at the table were like, how can you go to services if you don't believe in God? And we were like, well, you do it, and then you come believe in God again. That it was just, I mean, one of many, many, many memorable moments, but that's something that I think is very different about the Jewish tradition. If your normal orientation is Protestantism, is like, you don't have to believe in it, just do it, and that'll work out for you in your head after.
There are strains even within Protestant Christianity, though I agree they're definitely in the minority opinion. But for what it's worth, I've been also sort of like drawn to this a biographer of Thomas Cranmer, an Anglican bishop. But I can't, it's one of these like great lines that gets attributed to like all sorts of famous people, but I believe it was the biographer of this bishop, not the bishop himself, nor Augustine or any number of people who have been attributed, to whom this quote has been attributed. It is an Augustinian idea, I take it, which is what the heart loves, what is it? What the heart loves, the will chooses, and the mind last of all justifies. But you're getting like
there's still no
a step before that, right? Which is like, no, what you do with your deeds, then your heart will, then your heart follows. There's a statement of Jesus's in the gospel. About the investment of treasure through what you do. But anyway, this is wonderfully upside down for so many of my like theological intuitions. Am I overextending the metaphor if I think, so if I'm back to that tree with the roots and the branches, am I overextending the metaphor then to think that certain sorts of wisdom at least they grow out of deeds rather than, again, the other way around?
I think that's definitely a way to say it. That there's a certain type of like depth that's only given to you once you've done the thing itself. And a lot of rabbinic teachings, I think less so, let's go with this, less so in Pirkei Avot than other places, are actually, we're talking about some specific legal topic. How am I supposed to behave in such a situation? And the answer will be, I saw this rabbi who was in this situation, and this is what he did. And so there's even like a way in which rabbinic teaching comes from watching someone do things, and then that creates this sort of lasting impression. It's a very kind of like, nowadays we all love this like pedagogy, like experiential education sort of stuff, and I feel like Jewish literature has been all over that for a very long time of sort of, yeah, like you got to do the thing and that's how you're going to know how to do it. And you can read about it all you want, but until you've actually like, there's all sorts of areas of Jewish law where you can't actually become an expert in them just by reading the books. You have to, like, let's say you're, this is a little gory, but like you're a ritual slaughterer. You can't just like read the books and know how to do that. You have to like have a knife and have learned what it means for a knife to not, if your knife is nicked, the slaughter is not kosher. So like you have to learn how to make sure your knife is a kosher knife. And in between every slaughter, even in like a factory slaughterhouse, a kosher factory slaughterhouse, they're checking their knives. And that's just like a practical piece of wisdom that is Torah. I would call that wisdom Torah, but you can't learn it out of a book. And there's, I think, so much of Jewish practice that's actually like that.
That's powerful. All right. Well, I'm going to keep thinking about that tree, and because I think that gives me hope. For example, that there might be. I think it might have been Miroslav Volf, my colleague at Yale, who said at some point to me, sometimes our practices are, sometimes our practices are smarter than our ideas. And I think there's, you're pushing me further down that road, which is really helpful. All right. Where else? All right. Let's make sure that we get a chance to talk about this. You are a female modern Orthodox rabbinate. This is that is a striking just identity and like person to be in the world for some who have not encountered, right? I'm sure you may hang out in circles where that's much more common. Okay,
those
not so
circles
much.
don't exist.
Those circles don't exist. You're making those circles right now. But questions of gender, they pop up in this text, right? And we're reading a thing called like the sayings of the fathers, and it's not just under the heading, but we even get like right in chapter 1 warnings about like talking to women too much, and the ways that might like corrupt your character, presumably the you that's being addressed. So it's not even just like what it's saying about gender, but the assumptions it's making about who it's talking to. These are serious. These are concerns that might make some people just like put a book down. You are instead, it draws you further in somehow, or like how do you take this up?
Okay, well, I'm not like a masochist, but it's not like, oh, the more it makes me angry, the more I love it. That's definitely not it. I am in a lifelong love affair with the rabbis. I think the Jewish tradition is absolutely like astonishingly brilliant, and that motivates. Meaning, I don't think I fully like articulated how large the Talmud is. So let's say it like this: if you study a page of Talmud a day, and by a page I mean a folio, so 2 sides of a page of Talmud every day, it will take you 7.5 years to learn the entire Talmud. I'm engaged in that exact project. And I'll be done in a number of years from now. But there has not been a day of my adult life since I was in 7th grade that I have not opened the Talmud. That is like a very serious commitment to a document and a wisdom source. And that document and wisdom source is often challenging and often hurtful. It's meant to be challenging for all of its readers. It's meant to encourage you to bend your mind and think about complicated ideas from perspectives you never would have taken on. And that's hopefully the point of all good literature, but particularly ancient legal literature. But yes, it's a document that was written by men for sure. Written in times when women were mostly not literate, certainly were not engaged in the discourse, where they couldn't even imagine women like me who would be sufficiently literate to participate at their level. For the most part, the Talmud does have certain women, just a small handful of named women and also not named women, who they kind of wonder about, like, oh, like this rabbi's wife, Rabbi Meir's wife, or we were just talking about Rabbi Elazar and Azariah. There's a few women, 3 named women in his generation who are all like very kind of quasi-rabbi figures, but they get tiny speaking lines that could tell you all of their speaking lines the whole Talmud. And that's really hard. And at the same time, if we feel like the Torah is a living Torah and it speaks through all generations, and in our generation, women are leaders in the world, we're engaged in the world, we're doctors and CEOs and all sorts of things, then like women have to have a space in the rabbinate also. So I'm one of the first 25 Orthodox women rabbis in the United States, but almost certainly also in the world. There were some people like secretly making rabbis in Israel preceding the institution that ordained me, so it's a little hard to count. And we feel that what we do is essential. I don't use the title rabbi, rather the title rabbanit, because women have been using that, learned women have been using that title to mean like rabbi's wife for a very long time. The first Jewish book written by a woman, she uses that title. And she's in the 1600s in Poland, in Tikhtin, Rabbanit Rebecca of Tikhtin. And she was rabbi's wife, but she played this super important communal function. She was an educator. She took care of her community. She did all things that rabbis do. She was just a woman. She wasn't professionalized because women weren't professionalized in her day. And now women are. We have to professionalize our career. But I feel like I'm just a descendant of what she was doing. And so then the question is like, okay, but still, like the text says, don't talk to a woman. What are you supposed to do about that? So I hope someday to write a book that does this like redemptive theological work on those exact statements. So how do we understand them? We understand them maybe when it says don't talk to a woman, it doesn't say don't talk to a woman, it says don't talk to a woman too much. So what is too much? Maybe it's too much when you've crossed a boundary. Maybe it's when you made a weird comment about her body. Maybe it's when you made her feel uncomfortable in her workplace. And to do that kind of redemptive work, which is to say, yes, these statements are so important and they're so meaningful and they're part of our tradition and they're still relevant today. And you could read them in a super misogynist, hurtful way, or you could find real, relevant, abiding wisdom in them. And to me, that's the very exciting project of it all.
Don't talk to a woman too much means don't like be a patriarchal jerk to a woman, right? Like don't.
That's when it becomes too much.
That's when it becomes too much.
Don't
I think you shared that interpretation with our students at Yale once. It rings a bell. I love it. I'm for it. Write that book and we'll talk about it here. That'd be great. All right. We'll again, vast text. We'll keep moving. I want to think a little bit about reputation. And maybe this is a place where we see a little bit of tension, or I'm seeing some tension, maybe you can help me navigate it. On the one hand, there seem to be some statements that like having a good name, Shem Tov, is an important thing. You should be, that's a desirable thing in life. And I guess I want to frame all of this in terms of saying like we live, I take it, in like a reputation obsessed culture. That social media, we rate everyone and everything. We are rated by everyone for everything. Sometimes, officially, if we you drive an Uber or deliver for DoorDash or whatever it is, you're getting rated constantly as like an instructor. You're going to show up on like rate my professor. If you're gonna, on Twitter, you're getting like essentially like rated. You're whether or not officially, right? You're getting taken down when people decide you need to be. All to say, all right. So we're really concerned about reputation. The rabbis have a different sort of take. Shem Tov, on the one hand, a good name seems to be something desirable, something you should maybe even hope for. But there's also, like in chapter 1, Hillel suggests that a name made great is a name destroyed. So you get sort of, is a reputation, what's the right way to be concerned? Because I think this is a really practical question. What's the right way to be concerned about your reputation? Because my hunch is like there are also some like wrong ways to be like concerned about one's reputation. what's the advice that we're getting here, or even more broadly from like the rabbinic tradition in terms of how we should think about reputation?
I think the rabbinic tradition takes reputation super seriously. I think it sees it as a very powerful tool. So another teaching by Rabbi Shimon is that there's three kind of crowns: the crown of Torah, the crown of priesthood, the crown of royalty. But there's secretly a fourth crown that's more important than any of them, which is the crown of a good name. It supersedes them all. Keter Shem Tov Olau Gavehan. And then there's also this idea that if you acquire for yourself a good name, you've like acquired it for yourself. So what does that mean? There's lots of different interpretations of what that statement means. But one of them is that it's something about like acquiring self-knowledge, like becoming that the acquisition of a good name is about even like becoming the fullest version of yourself. That so there's something like more complex even about what a good name could mean.
How old is that self-actualization sort of take? That strikes me as very modern.
Yeah, so the one I brought here is modern. The one that
I'm not doesn't mean that it's nothing against it. I'm just trying to understand the history of it.
I mean, it's not super. It's modern in the scheme of Jewish literature, so it's like 1600. It's not like
oh wow.
Sorry, I was like, oh, it's so modern. It's since the year 500.
No, I mean, to me, it sounds like Oscar Wilde or something like that. Yeah. Not.
Sorry. Yeah.
That's striking. So good. So then what's the difference between making for yourself a good name and this name that's made great being a name that's destroyed? What, like, again, I feel like I'm back to like the sort of like good sort of dispute, bad sort of dispute. What's the right sort of orientation towards my name or my reputation? What's the
so whenever you see two contradictory texts and or seemingly contradictory texts in Torah and Jewish documents, you have to ask yourself, am I supposed to make them agree, or do they actually just disagree? And I think in this situation you could really go in both directions. So you could say, yep, just two different reads. Like one is that no, actually, like if you're so reputation obsessed, there's something really bad about that, and your obsession with your reputation will ultimately lead to your downfall. Versus, no, if you care about your reputation, then you're going to make sure you're always acting appropriately. You're going to make sure you're kind to everyone, because the way other people see you is you want them to see the version of you that you want them to see, and that's going to then become the real version of you. And that's really good then. Like you're doing like external work, but by doing that external work, you're therefore also doing this internal work of deciding what the external work should be and making it happen.
Ooh.
So you could see those two things as really opposite approaches, both contained within this text. Or you could say that when you do this external work of trying to make curating your reputation, the real work of it is internal. You want to make sure that the way people see you is true and real to who you really are, and that that's the good version of it. And if it's all just manipulations and making sure that people are just saying nice things about you all the time instead of actually being a good person, that's what's going to eventually lead to your downfall, because you didn't do the matching internal work. So that would be a way to make them fit together.
That latter piece sounds to me like something Nietzsche says about vanity. He says the vain person is the person who works really hard to convince others of a lie about them about themselves, and then turns around and on the basis of that then external testimony believes that lie themselves. So it's sort of like crazy,
but
sort
as opposed to, let's say, Adam Smith, who says the basis of all morality is kind of being able to see yourself from the outside. And Steve Darwall at Yale, his book, The Second Person Standpoint, is also all about that. He also argues the basis of all morality is having a sense of how other people see you.
But in that case, there's, well, I'm stuck again with the sort of like, for Darwall, like, wow, we're really past the text here. But for Darwall, doesn't it have to be like seeing yourself as others? Yeah, but what would Darwall or Smith like do with that Nietzschean concern that like, if how other people see me is like a lie that I've convinced them of?
they both address that,
Okay.
that it has to be true, that and that you, when you're externalizing yourself and looking back on yourself, you know when it's a lie.
You know when it's a lie. Well, until we're too far gone, maybe.
Which brings our wall in to talk about.
Yeah. No, that's wonderful. Great. We have a question. I think I'm going to come back to it maybe at the end. If anybody else has a question, I'll like maybe ask one. Well, we're getting towards the end of time. You know what? I'm going to give preference to the question and make sure that we get it here. Which is just like basically a question that would just like love to follow up on Orthodox female rabbis. Like, help me understand. Like, I think there's like real interest to know like what's the history of the sort of birth of like I know there's probably a lot here, but like what could you share with us about the story of like how there came to be female Orthodox rabbis? Or
for sure. Well, there's like a really long story and a really short story. The longer part of the story is that, as I mentioned, there's always been, in every generation, there have been women scholars, typically the wives and daughters of rabbis themselves, who had access to this learning and even exercised it. So my like eight greats grandmother, great aunt, her name was Leah Horowitz, and I'm like not exactly named for her. It's complicated. There are a lot of cousins who married each other in my family. It's good for genetic diseases. Anyway, so she there's like stories about a guy who wrote like stories, short stories about the place in Galicia where she's from. Galicia is like a part of like Poland, Lithuania, Russia. Like they used to joke like we always speak the same language, but every other day we're in a different country. That was like the joke of the Jewish community there. Sometimes we're Austrian, sometimes we're Polish, whatever. So somebody who wrote about that community wrote about like, oh, when I was a kid and I was taking Talmud lessons with her brother, she would help me prepare. She knew all the answers to all the questions. And she even like wrote, she even left behind some writings that are like quite learned, right? So we have women like that before modern times who had access to learning because of the men that they had access to. So to say like learned women is modern is like complicated, but right around in much more modern times, so like the late 1800s, early 1900s, it starts to really bubble up of like women are beginning to get access to secular education, which means that if they don't have access to religious education, they're going to find other things so exciting, and they're going to leave the religious community. And so then in the 1920s, you have a figure named Sarah Schneerson in Poland, and she like convinced basically all these rabbis like we have to invest in Torah education for girls and women. And she founded girls' schools in Krakow. The building still stands. It was the first Torah school for women, founded by Sarah Schneerson, and it was 100 years since her, so there's a lot of literature coming out about her now, which is very cool, and a lot of new like scholarship and whatever. But even before her in Germany, actually, which was like a little bit ahead of Poland, some of this stuff like girls and women were already getting access to Torah education. And then even later, so like the school that I went to in America called the Maimonides School, it's a Jewish school in Boston. It was founded in the 1930s by a figure named Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, and he similarly felt like the time has come, like Torah education for women, high level to the Talmud, was women. The Talmud almost like explicitly bars women from its own study. The Palestinian Talmud says it would be better to burn the Torah than to give it to women, which is so it required these like bigwig rabbis to kind of say in our day and age, like the Jewish people are over if we don't start educating women. So that's like the 1930s, 1940s. Torah education for women really grows in the United States, but still not any kind of leadership position. And I grew up in that school that was founded in 1937. I graduated in 2009 and had almost no female teachers. Even though I sat in class with boys, like we were in classes together, co-educated. But there were slowly institutions popping up for advanced learning for women, which I took advantage of, but really was like almost the first generation of women who possibly could have had the education that I had access to. And then in that exact year that I graduated from high school, the first woman who then founded my organization was ordained by a very brave rabbi named Rabbi Avi Weiss. There was like all this fighting about it. And it was a really big deal. And then the first class graduated from Yeshivat Maharat, which is my ordaining institution, in 2013. I graduated college in 2014 and went straight there. So that's a little bit of like my story / the story of women's Torah education. But it was like a long process, and we're not done. Like, women are not judges. There's whole big pieces of Jewish law that there's like nowhere on earth that's educating Jewish women to become masters in those. Whereas like men who are good at what they do, it's like obvious for them where to go to study that. So project continues.
You mentioned the important work of Sarah Schneerson along the way. Is that any relation to the Lubavitch Rabbi Schneerson? Okay.
No.
Didn't. Yeah, it was just we got a question about that, and it had occurred to me too.
Well, the
living
Lubavitch
as I
Rebbe
do,
was like he was very in favor of education for women, and the Chabad community within the ultra Orthodox, particularly like the Hasidic communities, they're like huge like path breakers for women in all sorts of different ways. It's very cool, actually.
Interesting. As I think you know, this I live in the midst of such a community here on the west side of New Haven.
Yeah, you do.
All right, last question, and maybe this sort of returns back to, in some ways, to where we started. We sort of mentioned the sort of context of dispute and the centrality of dispute, and the way that one of the things I've always appreciated about that is the sort of intellectual humility that seems to come with that. And there are just some really striking passages for me that have, like I said, have always been important to me, including one that it always lands. It's just always, I think, like a memorable text for anybody who takes the Life Worth Living course at Grace Farms. Quick plug, we're starting up one of those real soon again. But when we talk about the question of suffering, we go back and forth, problem of evil questions, Buddhist approaches to this question. There's lots to say about suffering. But
we've all learned more about it recently.
Often the last word ends up going to Rabbi Yanai, who said, "It is not in our power to explain either the peace of the wicked or the suffering of the righteous." And just a sort of, it even goes back to the like, say little, do much, a sort of like, there's wisdom in knowing when to say we don't know and can't know. Is that, am I right to read that, or am I overreading that?
I think that's a great read of Rabbi Yanai. I do think it's important to know that he doesn't have the last word on this in the Jewish tradition. So I don't know, maybe like 600 years after him, you have Rav Sadia Gaon trying to understand these questions, and another, and around the years 1000, Rabbeinu Bachya tries again, and 1200, Maimonides also writes about this subject at length. There's, the fact that we're sitting here in 2022 and still asking these questions and looking back at Rabbi Yanai and saying, yep, is good, but I would just also caution that like the Jewish library is vast. So he's one voice of many, and certainly one that I also really love. That just like ein biyadinu, like it's just not in our hands. We can't understand it, and I think it's really helpful.
No, but that's a helpful clarification, because it's not a sort of throw up your hands and don't even try to like ask anymore, but it's within a sort of like rich tradition of like precisely trying to like wrestle with that question and take it up. And right, because there could be a sort of lazy, like, I don't know, right? But this isn't that, right? This is like, no, like, as we like wrestle with, as we often say in Life Worth Living, questions sort of like above our pay grade. You won't, like, doing the wrestling is important, but having some, also as you do that wrestling, having some sort of sense that like the answers I find I need to hold with open hands, the like sometimes I won't find any answers, and these sorts of moments of aporia, right? Moments of just like, maybe it's not in our power to explain, doesn't mean we won't stop trying. But anyway, that's helpful nuance and complication of that, which I think is really I find that to be like the honest place.
Yeah, the Talmud has like a lot of also like complex writings about this. Like the Talmud has this idea of like suffering that comes to people through love, which then means that like when the righteous suffer, it could be an act of love on behalf of God that makes them suffer, which is like a really, and like what does that mean? Like what is Yisurin Sha'ahava? What is the suffering of love? Is really complicated. But one of the things these texts have been on my mind recently because I've been counseling a couple in my community who unfortunately just had a stillbirth, and they've been asking all of these questions. Of course, they've been asking all of these questions, and one of the things that I always like to tell people is that something I learned in my rabbinic training in like a couples counseling class was that if they're arguing, they're gonna make it, and if they're not arguing, they might not. And that like approaching God in rage is actually still an approach and is actually still a relationship.
Yes.
And that so I've recently been sort of reading that into Rabbi Yanai also. We can't necessarily explain, but it doesn't mean we have to drop the subject either.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. The difference between the difference between just a sort of a bitterness and on the one hand, and like an anger, even like directed in like conversation with God, can be huge. It can be a huge difference.
The difference between relationship and not relationship.
Yeah. Leah, thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you for answering my questions, giving us a sort of way into this text. I do want to like encourage folks. The text is accessible on Sefaria.org. If you're looking for, we have this edition of the text in the Grace Farms library. So it has a whole bunch of commentary as well. I really encourage you, take it up. It really is. It's I think it doesn't need to be an intimidating text at all. It's full of all sorts of these just great aphorisms. I often tell my students it's sort of one of those texts where you get like the there's really like, it's sort of like news you can use, like quote to like put on the bathroom
stuff
mirror.
In my house all the time, like, oh, our heater broke. The more stuff you have, the more you have to worry about. Like a quote from Pirkei Avot.
There you go. Biggie was just working with Pirkei Avot. More money, more problems. All right, Leah, thank you so much, and to all of you who are here live as well. Thanks for joining us today. I hope you'll join us for upcoming faith programming as well at Grace Farms. As I mentioned, Life for the Living course kicking off in a few weeks. You can sign up for that online right now. For our next Books on Faith and Meaning events coming up in the next couple months as well. So thanks, Leah. Thanks all of you for being here today. Be well.